Perguntas nos fazem ficar inquietos.
Us restless. Questions make the world go round. The major discoveries, the major inventions, the major philosophical texts, all of them started from a question. The answers are not easy. They require effort and dedication, and this is the work of the researcher. Each researcher and each researcher are pillars of science. They are the ones who drive and generate social and human development and bring the answers necessary for modern life. And that's not all. They also generate more questions that make of the world a constant and ongoing discovery. We of the Cities Group are committed to education for the future. We value and encourage questions and above all, the work of the researcher. Come with us on this major journey of knowledge.
Bom dia a todos.
Good morning, everyone. We are starting now our third and last day of the CIFOP. And I'll just like to remind you that we have in the other room the possibility of listening directly the translation, so those who need it can go there. And I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name is Maria Fernanda Schneider. I am a doctor in education, master's in human rights, and journalist by graduation. I've been for more than 10 years acting with communication and marketing in the Pequeno Príncipe Hospital. We are now going to start the conference, a pedagogy of the research methodology. It's time to think about this as Professor Dr. Aaron Kuntz. Please join us. Dr. Kuntz is the Dean of the School, the College of Education and Human Development of Florida International University, and has the title of Frost Professorship, an honor for faculty that stand out and inspire excellence. During 3 years, he was also a president of the Department of Counseling, Recreation, and School Psychology in the same institution. Before acting in Florida International University, Professor Kuntz was a member of the faculty of the Alabama University, where he received the award for research and was the president of the Educational Studies Department. As professor in research methodology, Dr. Kuntz has published more than 50 articles, including 5 books. His latest book, Qualitative Inquiry Cartography and the Promise of Material Changes, received an award in 2020 in the Outstanding Book Award of the Qualitative Dipsych of American Educational Research Association. His research is based in empirical questions about the effect of research and teaching practices in the arena CK16, that is, from kindergarten to graduation. The work of the faculty in post high school institutions and the impact of the environment in the learning building. Good morning.
This works?
Nope, não consigo ver.
I found the power button. Thank you so much for that nice introduction. I like my bio better in Portuguese than in English. It sounds more sophisticated. I'm so happy to be here. I want to give thanks to the committee that formed this wonderful Congress, and of course to Prof. Ju, which I've learned to call you, who has become quite a nice friend, I think, over the time of planning, and the warmth that we felt here has been quite amazing. Again, my name is Aaron Kuntz. I thought I'd start by giving a differently layered background to me from my traditional biography. I should also say that I am caffeinated. I have coffee, so I hope the poor translator has coffee as well, because I tend to speak quickly when I have coffee. So my background is in my undergraduate, when I got my bachelor's degree, I actually had three majors or three areas of focus. I had philosophy, English literature, and gender studies. And this gives you a sense of my personality because normally at my college you have one, but because I can't hold focus in one place, I chose to do three. After that, I went and got my master's actually in English literature. And I was very excited to read good books, and I was excited to meet new people. And when I started my master's degree, I realized it was not like that. It was all theory and philosophy. And when I came to my first class, Professor Sussman sat down and said, "We will read Foucault, and we will read everybody in relation to Foucault." And I call that my wonderful indoctrination into education. However, after the 2 years, it was a master's and PhD program, I stopped out because I felt like it was only wordplay. I felt like what we were doing in my master's was just intellectual stimulation and it had no material connection. So I stopped, I left the academy, and I worked for 5 years doing odd jobs and doing different things. And then I started teaching, and someone came along and said, "You can keep doing odd jobs, you can keep teaching the odd class, but if you want to go on, you need to get your doctorate." So then I went on and got my doctorate of education. And the reason I bring this up is it's very important to me that the work that we do has a material grounding, that is not just words, that it has an impact on the world. My definition of education is that we work for change, even as we ourselves are changed. That it is not just a one-directional process, that we need to shift and change the world. Otherwise, I should be doing something else, and I don't have that many other skills. So this is what I got. I'm talking today about a pedagogy of research methodology. My formal training is in philosophy and in research methodology, primarily as a qualitative researcher. I come out of the educational research faculty, and so I think a lot about how do we teach educational research and research methods. So the key questions that I want to talk about today and kind of work through have to do with how we have historically trained educational researchers and towards what ends. Why are we training people in the way that we're training them when it comes to research methods and methodology? And then I want to get at the philosophical and value-laden assumptions that govern that training, right? Why, again, how do we conceptualize what methodologies do and what they can be? Now, I don't normally do this, but I do have a lot of slides, mainly because I thought it would be nice if you don't speak English to be able to have something to look at if you need to use Google Translator. So we'll work through that. I came up with a quick outline of what I'll be talking about. The first thing is about conventional research, and by conventional research, I mean the traditional research methods that you would see in an introductory research methods textbook in the United States and North America, as well as throughout the world as it's spread. I'm going to talk about a difference that I make between research and inquiry, because I think it's important that we think about how we inquire as different than the type of research. I want to talk about what we mean when we say we experience something. And because in qualitative research, we often are trying to articulate and understand others' experiences. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to give an example of a PhD program that we are designing, and is not there yet, but we are in design. Talk about the mattering of methodologies. I'm going to make a plug for what I call materialist methodologies, and this is this movement back to trying and understand how methodologies might work with the material world. And then I'm going to end with this notion of a very practical example of how we might teach method. So this comes primarily from my two most recent books that I've been working through. I'm in the process of writing another book right now, so it may be, when you see me, I like to say, I like to be on the edge of thought. And so when you see me struggling, I think that's a good place. It's because I'm trying to conceptualize differently. This first one, the response, is called The Responsible Methodologist, Inquiry, Truth-Telling, and Social Justice. And I wrote that one because I write best when I'm frustrated and annoyed. I became annoyed because people were talking about criticality and criticalness in a way that was very general. And I take being critical and critique very seriously. And so my worry was that if everybody is critical, then the term means nothing, right? It is everything and nothing at the same time, and I want it to mean something. I also wanted to be able to talk about truth. And in my field, if you are a post-structuralist or a postmodernist, it is hard to talk about truth because it gets at a totality that we necessarily critique. But I think truth is important. This text, Qualitative Inquiry, Cartography, and the Promise of Material Change, is my interest in cartographic work, is the creation of maps that interests me. And I think about inquiry as a mapping process. So I wanted to give you that sort of background. Remember, I said I was indoctrinated into Foucault. I like this quote. It's often cited a lot, where Foucault says, my point is not that everything is bad, but everything is dangerous. And often that's the end of the quote that you'll see. But what he goes on to say is that's not exactly the same as bad, because if everything is dangerous, then we always have something to do. So I like this quote from Foucault because he's removing judgment. So what you're going to see is when I critique conventional research, I am not judging it as good or bad. I'm saying that it's dangerous in particular ways, just like others, and myself included, might say my notion of inquiry and relational understanding is dangerous in particular ways. It's not a judgment. I actually think we need both. So please keep this quote in mind as I do go through my work today. Foucault also says he calls himself a hyper-pessimistic activist, which I think is an interesting phrasing. He uses his pessimism about the social world to move him towards action. Sometimes when I get pessimistic about the world, I become inactive. I lay in my bed and drink coffee and watch bad movies. But Foucault says, no, this should make us go towards something new. Okay, so let's get into this. I'm interested in what are the methodological effects. So when we look at conventional educational research, remember this is the traditional educational research that many of our grad students are trained in. There's an emphasis on technical application of method, right? How do you do an interview? How do you do a basic statistical analysis? That values efficiency and standardization. How do you do it quickly? I need to be able to finish my thesis or dissertation at some point. How can I move through it? And there's also an emphasis on methodological products, the outcome over the process. When we have this, you end up with a generation of what it means to be a methodological expert and what it means to have methodological expertise. We heard of the first keynote of this Congress, this notion of what does it mean to be an expert. It can become very narrow, and as a result, it can block other people out, right? So I sit on a lot of dissertations and thesis as a methodologist. So I'll be sitting around the table, and when they start talking about methodological matters, everyone turns and looks at me and waits for me to chime in with my expertise. And it also emphasizes what I said, methodological products. That means static outcomes, right? I often talk about in graduate school, we actually need to show people the process of research over and above the product, right? Barbara said the other day, when you see, it might take you a year to write an article. So when I design my courses, if I'm only showing them the articles, the graduate students are saying to me, I can never do this. This is too smart. So you never see the process. And I will say this took a year of work. If you look at my books, that's 3 years of work. But if that's the only thing we're showing graduate students, we're doing them a disservice. We need to actually show them the drafts, right? The markups, where you messed up, where the best conference presentation I was ever at, this fellow, John Petrovic, was presenting his thoughts in his work, and there was a critical question. He looked at him and he said, "You know, you're right. I got it wrong. I'm only partially right." And I thought, boy, was that brave, because it's hard to show yourself as an unfinished product, right? So I want to change this notion of expertise. So the other thing that conventional research gets us is what I call a subjectivity around being a middle manager. That's the expert. This is the person who can push the buttons of method, but perhaps doesn't know the ideas and the concepts behind method. So with students that are interested in SPSS or R or SAS, they can make it work. But the truth is, if you have bad data going into any of these software programs or in vivo or anything, you get bad results. So my worry is, and I do worry a lot, that's why I have gray hair, my worry is that we're producing, out of educational research, we are producing middle managers. We are not producing people who are as thoughtful or conceptual as I'd like them to be, and I trace that back to how we teach method. And then as a result, if we come with static and measurable outcomes, we understand then education as necessarily knowable by defined and static things. Think about the proxy. In the United States, we use proxy measures to talk about what a good teacher is. That means you're a good teacher if your students score well on tests. That's an incorrect assumption. There are many good teachers who are doing things like making sure their students have food. That makes them a good teacher, even if their students don't do well on the test and the GRE or on those types of things. So this is partly my concern. So, excuse me, I begin with the presumption that we need to reconceptualize towards inquiry that moves away actually from technique and procedure. That we need to move away from mere descriptions of the status quo and towards inquiry and methodology as interventions. I'm very interested in the possibility for inquiry work that changes by virtue of its practice as opposed to its outcomes. This is something like our work with communities changes communities and changes ourselves, not just the outcome of our work, right? We have to think about these things in processes, and we have to think about these things in relation. So inquiry necessarily does not describe the status quo, it disrupts the status quo. Okay, so here's my distinction between conventional research and what I'm terming relational inquiry. Conventional research is procedural. It operates on assumed and prior ethical positions. This is, in my university, if you want to do a study that involves other humans, you have to go through the Institutional Review Board. We call it the IRB, and they check off on it. Now, the IRB was designed to make sure that our studies were ethical. That's actually a great idea. But the outcome of this is that you can assume before the study begins that it's ethical. So I'll say to my students, is your study ethical? They will say, yes. I will say, how do you know? They will say, because I have this checklist that the IRB gave me. And this checklist tells me it is, before they have even gone into a community. I actually think differently about ethics. I think ethics are immanent, which means that they come from the moment of which you study. You go into the community and you make ethical choices you did not anticipate beforehand, right? But you can't do that with conventional research. It maintains the status quo, as I said before, and actually conventional research most often documents change. It does not manifest change. And to me, that's part of a problem. It can lead to research that informs change, but the actual study itself doesn't produce change. So I'm interested in relational inquiry. When we learned so nicely about resilience the other day, the importance of that was that it is relational. You can't have resilience in isolation. That is, you can't have resilience, we learned, that's outside of community. So resilience presupposes that you are in community, that you are in commune with other people. So does inquiry. It is necessarily relational, and it actually begins with ethical questions. And this is hugely important to me, which is that it makes visible the operating logic and values that go into the methodologies. In my classes, we talk as much about the values that drive our study as the procedure of the study itself. And then again, it seeks change through its enactment. We try to produce change through the very methodologies we use. So we begin with questions like, how does this inquiry enact a particular ethical stance? That's the question you begin with in the curriculum, as opposed to the question at the end. What values inform the inquiry project, and how do they align with inquiry goals? And what changes does this inquiry affect? So in my classes, in my thinking, in my writing, these are the questions that I begin with. Yeah? As an aside, I'm so proud that I got to get that angle. I have not tell you how long it took me to make that angle and change the color on the slide, because I am an old man. Okay, so there are those questions that I think govern inquiry. I also make the claim that conventional research begins from a logic of extraction. That if we look at the logic and values that informs conventional research, it is based on extracting knowledge from somebody else. In a traditional interview, I am meant to sit down with you and get your experience from you and interview you and drill down, and it does not change me. It is meant to be pulled out. This is extraction, right? You might be seeing a little bit of a Marxist bent here. It relies on representational systems. What does that mean? It means that it starts to make representations of experience and value the representation of the experience over and above the experience itself. The original experience falls away. I'm going to give an example in just a bit. Whereas relationally, materialist inquiry operates on a relational logic. Right? So if up here you had a logic of extraction, down here you have a relational logic, which means we have to have relational ethics. That is to say, I can't determine what the ethical obligations are that I have by myself. I need to rely on my relationship to communities. And educational research, particularly in North America, has a long history of people going in and studying communities and pretending that their ethics are better than the communities. And what we need to do is actually join with communities and develop ethics together. That's what I want. That's what I'm talking about as relational ethics. Okay, so I mentioned the logic of extraction. Removes data from a material context, and it actually generates data as commodities. So when you go to publish, right, your data set becomes the transactional thing. Oh, do I have good enough data to get published? Here's my commodity. It's kind of like saying, here's my money. Will you accept it, right? So data become commodities, and they become reapplied in alternative circumstances. That's it. They become extracted out and put over here, right? Data become untouched by time and space. That is to say, the data are understood to be the same across decades or the same across continents, right? They become this precious thing that never changes, an artifact. And processes stop and practices become fixed. Everything is boop, done. There's no more movement. And actually, I find this unethical. I don't think this is how it operates. But again, this is a governing logic. And remember, I'm not saying that it's necessarily wrong. I'm saying that it's dangerous. And it's particularly dangerous because this logic of extraction, at least in North America, where I'm coming from, it's the dominant logic in educational research right now. So I'm going to give you an example of this. I try to be very grounded. I try to be silly a little bit. So if we do a traditional interview, we have an experience. I'm going to interview Barbara. No, I'm going to interview Anna. Sorry, you're excuse me. And I'm going to interview Anna about some experience or phenomenon that she has had in the past. So, let's work through this. I sit down with her with my questions, and she tells me her experience, and I record it on my phone. Now that experience is now linguistically based, and it is a data file. I really mean this. Let's follow this in very mundane ways. Then I go home, and I take that data file, and I produce a transcript. Yeah? It becomes now words on a page. Think of what's already been lost. Often inflections, often the context in which it was made. Then I take that transcript and I start coding it. Now, I like to do open, axial, and selective coding, right? There are very sophisticated ways that we can transcribe it. So now, we've moved from the actual experience to the telling of the experience, to the recording of the experience, to the transcribing of the experience, to coding, which breaks up the experience into little bits of data, right? And then I'm going to reinterpret, I'm going to take that data back together and cobble it together into a journal article, which will be published because we're fabulous. And I'm going to claim there's something new there, yeah? And I say to my students, this makes so much sense. Why is this not the weirdest process we've ever recognized? Why do we not see this and say, how come? What are the values in this? We were joking on the drive here. It's not as though, this is made up, right? This is completely made up. It's not as though it was on Moses' tablets, right? This was generated over time. And we talk about, for example, other key terms, like we talked about data saturation, right? It is a made-up term. It's helpful, but it's made up. And what is data saturation? Well, what data saturation is you start getting the same types of data. What I tell my students is data saturation is code for, I'm tired. I want to stop the study. So I'm going to come up with a technical term that I can say to my professors, or I can say to an editor, oh, I've achieved data saturation. So now I can write. Well, anybody who has worked in schools or done qualitative research, you know that you can have the same conversation over and over and over again and keep getting different interpretations. Anybody who's worked with children knows, like, oh, I'm doing this fabulous study with children. You can ask the same question over and over again, get 100 different answers. Data saturation is a made-up term. Again, it's useful and it's dangerous because who decides that you're getting repetitive data? This process decides, yeah? So I like to mess with people with this idea of interview. I still do interviews. I still do this process. So again, but I think it's imperative that we understand the values behind it because then we can do it knowledgeably. Okay, so I ask, what happens to actual events or the actual experience during this process? And what does this process assume about the nature of experience? It assumes that it can be pulled out and extracted. Right? It assumes that it need not simply be felt. And we know that not all experiences can be coded. I love this quote. Michel de Certeau, who's a philosopher, wrote, when someone asked him about the meaning of a sonata, it is said, Beethoven merely played it over. Beethoven refuses the representational turn. Beethoven refuses to interpret the sonata for the listener. So when we went and had that fabulous dinner and the fabulous talk about resilience, how can we capture that in coding? There are things, this is to say there are things that escape, that are in excess of it. And I would submit that what is in excess of it is experience itself. Have you ever been moved by a painting? Ever been moved by a song? Artists know this, but methodologists try to nail it down. And when they nail it down, I would submit something is lost, and this is particularly important in education when we think, what is the experience of being in a classroom? What is the experience of teaching a classroom, right? So keep this in mind. Okay, so I want to offer a different notion of experience, and it does come from my boy Foucault. that experience actually means that there has been a change, that an experience demands that you become different through the experience. You can no longer go back, right? So when I mentioned one of my majors was gender studies in college. And there you will, in gender studies, maybe watch a movie or talk about some cultural event as patriarchal, right? Why are all the women in this show put in a submissive state, right? Why are all these, right? So I started this gender studies thing. I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. And then you might learn about the violence of sport. Why do we cheer when someone gets knocked over? So then I become the annoying friend that nobody wants to watch a movie with anymore because I've been changed. Because we'll be watching a show and I'll be like, do you see that? Do you see that? So look what they're doing to the women. Why are all the white people doing so well in this show and anyone who is not white is doing so poorly? Why are they making fun of them but not them? And all my friends are like, could we just watch a TV show without talking? Can we just watch a football match without wondering about like the breaking of bodies and that type of thing? Well, no, because I had the experience, it changed me. Yeah, I still watch them, but I keep it in my head, I've learned. So I want us to think about experiences as actually changing who you are, and they could be large life experience changes, or they could be very mundane. It is the student who raises their hand and says something, and the teacher chooses not to put their words on the board. And then another student raises their hand, and that teacher puts their words on the board. If you've ever experienced that, you slink down a little bit more in your chair. It's a very mundane daily experience, but it changes you because maybe you think, I'm not a good student. We know, for example, that in the United States, girls do quite well in math, in science, all the way up until about 8th or 9th grade, and then they don't do well. Part of the reason for that is how they are treated in the classroom, because they are treated as though they don't understand science or they don't understand math, so it becomes part of their identity. How many of us have talked with a student who says, I'm just not good at math, right? What does that mean, you're not good at math? Nobody is just good at math. Even Einstein was stumped by a few math problems, right? But you see, it becomes an identity in a very small way. So we can think of it in a big one, we can think of it in a small one. And the reason I raise this is what Foucault talks about experience having the task of tearing the subject from itself in such a way that it is no longer basically the original subject. Experience tears me from myself. It prevents me from always being the same. Now that is a big statement. And it does happen. We've all, I think, gone through a degree of some sort of crisis, and you're like, I can no longer be the way that I once was. But I also want to say that Foucault here is also talking about very small events. We are torn every day in terms of how we experience. This is why with my kids and with others, I tell them travel is so important. You will travel to another country, as I have here to Brazil, and you will be forever changed. This is about breaking up stereotypes. It's about changing who you are. So then, given this, what is an engaged educational experience? If we really believe that experience changes people, what is it? And then, furthermore, how do we inquire into it, right? It's complicated. I don't actually have the answer, so if you're waiting, you might as well leave now, because I'm just going to keep asking questions. But what I will say is that engaged academic practice is relational. It necessarily connects with communities. We can no longer study in isolation. We can no longer go into our universities and close the doors. Now, I am a dean of the School of Education, and what I say to my faculty is we have to look ourselves in the mirror. Colleges and universities have a lot of explaining to do to local communities and communities far. We have to say, how have we treated them in the past, and how are we going to treat them in the future? It refuses problems with answers. Gilles Deleuze talks about the problem with education, he's another French post-structural philosopher, is that what we give students are problems with answers. We offer up problems that we already know the answers to, and we just ask students to give it back to us. right? Freire might talk about this in relation to the banking concept of education. So we understand that within an educational mode, but Deleuze points to that's actually what we do in society. We're always asking problems that we already know the answers to, and being a good thinker is to more efficiently answer the question, yeah? When I was a kid in school, I thought that the smartest kid was the one who raised their hand first after the question, right? A teacher asks a question, boom. Actually, we know that that's not true. And I'm not saying that just because I had a hard time raising my hand fast. We actually know that it takes about 7 seconds to process a thoughtful question and to produce a thoughtful response. So pedagogically, when we're in classes and we ask a question and we expect an immediate response, we're actually cutting off thought, right? And what we should actually do is ask a question that we don't know the answer to and say, don't answer right away. Think. This is why writing is so important, right? We talked about this throughout this week as well. Someone once explained to me that writing is the ultimate cognitive act. You learn through writing. You learn about yourself. You learn about your thoughts through writing. So what we need to do is refuse problems with answers. We need to actually focus on asking better questions, and the better questions are the ones that we have no idea what the answer is. And actually, when we met yesterday with the international office, they talked about this area of incubation where businesses would come forward and say, we have this problem, we can't figure it out. And it's so interesting to me that they can do that in the business world, but we feel like we can't do that in education. That if you actually say, I don't know, that's a period of weakness. Imagine if you're defending your thesis, you're defending your dissertation, and one of your mentors asks you a question, and you are like, yeah, I got nothing. I got no idea. You would never do that. Instead, what you would do is you would deflect. Oh, it's interesting that you asked that. And you would start talking round and around. You know, that makes me think of this other study that did this. And you're away from the question, away from the question, away from the question. But that actually should be seen as a wonderful moment, because it links to this notion of education as open, not closed. Education is about open practices, open processes. We don't actually know what the future is. There's a problem when we start to predict what the future is. In my country, we have the ACT, the SAT, and the GRE. Those are meant to be predictive tests. So you need to take the GRE and it will predict how you do in graduate school. Well, we actually know that that's not how it works. That how you do in graduate school or how you do in undergraduate is much more dependent on teacher recommendations than on a GRE score or an SAT score. Because an SAT score actually measures cultural knowledge. It uses terms that not everybody is aware of. I was working with a student in Miami and they were practicing for the SAT, and it was a simple math problem about someone who gets in a kayak and at what point they leave, how far they go, and how much time it took them to get there. And the student said, I can't answer this. And I said, why? And they said, I don't know what a kayak is. So I can't even conceptualize movement because I don't know what it is. You see? So we need to start saying that, no, these are open practices. These are not closed. And that the education generates experiences. Now remember what I talked about, experiences. Experiences changes yourself. So that means that education necessarily changes you. Remember, I began this talk with the premise that education is about working for change, even as you yourself are changed. So now, engaged academic practice means we're working towards experience. You can probably see where I'm going with this, because now we have to think, how do we understand and research experience? So I start thinking, as we've talked about in this, a little bit in this Congress, about graduate student socialization. How can we work with graduate students such that we don't presume that knowledge is static, meaning it doesn't change? We know that knowledge changes. And actually, physicists know this, right? Going from Newton to Einstein is a huge leap, yeah? But we don't often know this in education. And when knowledge is not static, we have to say that our students are not static, that they change necessarily, yeah? We have to socialize students to try to work towards relational experiences as opposed to individual experiences. As dean, I am in a battle right now with my provost. And the reason I'm in a battle with my provost is I want us to be able to have community-based and collaborative dissertations and theses. But the model, the American model is you take classes with others for 2 years, and then once you start doing your comprehensive exam, you are on your own. You take your comprehensive exam on your own, sometimes in a closed room. You write your dissertation or your thesis on your own. And actually, the data tell us that that's not a healthy educational moment, that education has to happen in relation. So I go to my provost, why can we not have a collaborative thesis? Why can't we have a thesis that has multiple authors? And they will say, like, well, how will you judge how much work they did? You see how quickly that moves to a question of assessment. And I will say, I don't believe assessment should be the driving force for educational practice. I think we should figure it out. We also know that some of the best research that we do is with communities. So I say, why can't we honor communities by including them on their publications? It's not an individual's work, which is when you look at the journal article, you think, oh, one person did this. Someone had to let them in the door. Someone went and got them water. Someone went and said, oh, you should talk to this person. So why can't we have multiple authorship, both from the academy and from the community? As an aside, many community members are like, why would I want that? But I am saying that this is an important thing. But I get so much pushback on this because they can't imagine it being any other way. It's because we've been socialized to such a degree, we've lost the imaginative capacity. We can't even think that there would be something else. Okay, there's a problem without an answer. That's great. That's what I want. And I say these things and my provost nods. It's like, okay, I think we're done here. I might not be dean for very long. So we seek out relational problems. I want graduate students to seek out relational problems that don't have answers. I want graduate students that work for transformation, not stasis. I want a student that says, I know that there's this problem here. I don't know what the answer is. I have this hunch that I want to work with this community or my community in a particular way because I think the working with them will actually be transformative, not the output. The actual working with them will be transformative to them and me. And again, we emphasize education as experimentation. I think we've lost this sense. Experimentation happens in art as much as it does in science. To experiment is to try something out, right? It's to say like, oh, let's experiment with this. Let's see what happens with this. But if you're working with static knowledge, you don't want to try it out because you're already assuming what the end goal will be. Right? So as a result, we generate lessons plans or we generate curriculum that have a predictive capacity to them. So we say, oh, if they take this course and then they take this course and they take this course, it will then result in this thing. Instead of saying, why don't we muck around a little bit? I'll give you an example of this comes from me in terms of my own philosophical understanding, but it came to me also from my experience as a graduate student. Now remember, I came out of an English literature program that was very hardcore on theory. And I took some time off because I was frustrated with it, and I came back. And I was at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I took my first semester of education courses. And I know this doesn't happen here, but I sat in my seat and I thought, this is so boring. What we are talking about educational policy, this is the most, and I thought, what have I done to myself? But because I'm stubborn, I went to my committee and I said, education is meant to be inherently interdisciplinary. You're forcing me into this discipline. I should be able to create my own program of study. And they were like, who is this guy? He just came in off the streets. And because again, I'm stubborn, I wrote up a new program of study that did not include one education course. I took courses in anthropology, I took courses in economics, I took courses in sociology, I took courses in philosophy, and it is a credit to my committee that they said, and maybe it's because they wanted me out the door, but they were like, go ahead. So for a year and a half of my coursework, I did not take one education course because I wanted to go where my questions went. I was interested in class analysis. Oh, I should take economics to understand how economics work. I was interested in gendered forms of education. I took a gendered sociology course. I was interested in culture. I took an anthropology course. And I would submit, and again, this is not here, because here the faculty are amazing, they're invigorating, they're engaged, they're multidisciplinary, but I think those courses were better than the courses that I could have taken on educational policy, right? So I want us to recreate this notion of experimentation. This is a problem. It's a problem with how the institution is set up. Because if you want to do a dissertation or a thesis, you have to do a dissertation or thesis proposal. And you can't put in that proposal, at least at my institution, I don't know what I'm going to do. I think I'm going to go try this out. I don't know what the answers are going to be, but Some faculty actually understand the proposal as a kind of contract. Tell me what you're going to do and what you think is going to come out of it. Do you see how the institutional norm works against the very notion of experimentation here as I've offered it? So I want us to challenge that at an individual and an organizational level. And here's a stab at it. Now remember this, we haven't done this yet. This is what we're planning. Trying to come up with a PhD that we're calling Psychological Sciences in Education. And it's going to have 2 tracks. The first track we're calling Scientist Methodologists. These are people like me that focus on research methodology. They're actually really interested in the process of inquiry and research. It's oriented towards interdisciplinary research. So imagine you have people coming in, oh, I'm going to go on this track. Then we have a track that is a scientist practitioners. These are the folks that are interested in evaluation and working in local teams. They're both taking courses together. They're both experimental. And then they're going to generate working groups on educational problems. So we would never have one working group just from the scientist methodologist group. That actually, through their coursework, they're coming up with the problems we need to inquire into. They're coming up, so the curriculum is a living curriculum. It generates with time, and it will vary from year to year. This is probably why we haven't implemented yet, because we have a lot of institutional roadblocks. But I'm a big believer that this would be a very strong PhD, because it would teach you to work in groups. It would teach you to be relational. It would teach you to think beyond yourself. It would teach you to begin with ethics and values as opposed to procedures. So to be continued, I'll let you know how that goes. And I wanted to give a bit of a background as to also why I believe in this so much. I think that methodologies themselves, the methods we use, both encode and decode. Now, what do I mean by that? Traditionally, we think of methodologies as simply decoding. That is, it's breaking apart and we're trying to decode what the experience is. But I also want to say that methodologies encode, which means they produce the experience. Yeah? That the very methods themselves produce something in their work. And if we only understand methodologies as decoding, we're missing things. Let me give you another example from the interview. Traditionally, in interview textbooks, you are meant to do an interview in a very boring room, sitting down with no distractions. Yeah? You find a room, you sit down, and you talk for an hour and a half or however long, and you record it. Now, that is the most unnatural human experience that you can have, especially in education. Talk to a teacher. How often do you have 90 minutes by yourself in a room with nothing there? Right? So there's an example of a methodology encoding. It is built on the presumption that distraction is bad. Actually, distraction can be quite good. There's the thought that Einstein started thinking about relativity when he sat in a bathtub. Oh no, when he stepped on the train, right? There's the idea if you're really stuck on something, go take a shower, because you start to think differently. About distraction can be great. So we might do something like walking interviews, which I quite like. Wear a lapel mic, go walk through an arboretum, get lost in thought even as you get lost walking around. In that way, the methodology is making possible something. When I interviewed and worked with kindergarten teachers, they refused to sit with me. This is how I learned. They're like, come to my classroom. And the classroom was alive. It had things hanging from the ceiling. It had things all around. It had maps. And kids would come in and run and laugh and run back out. It was great. But think about how the very classroom itself changes over time as you graduate forward. In the US, you will see a kindergarten classroom like I just talked about. It's three-dimensional, things hanging. By the time you get into middle school, which is like 6 through 8, there are fewer things on the wall, and there's probably not anything hanging because it's not as cool. You get to high school, there are things on the wall, but they're not really artistic. Sometimes they're just numerical. If you come to my university, nobody has a homeroom anymore. The rooms are occupied by different faculty at different times, and we're actually not allowed to put anything on the walls because it'll tear the paint, right? So do you see how we have moved from an educational environment that's alive and together, that recognizes bodies? And by the time you get to graduate school, like we've talked before, you are meant not to have a body. You're meant to only be a mind. You're meant to take a class with me for 3 hours, as though you didn't have to go to the bathroom, as though you didn't have to be uncomfortable sitting in that chair for 3 hours. And one time I was teaching a class, and some of you know I also have taught yoga in the past, and I was teaching a class on embodiment. And I looked around and I said, not one person here, we've been reading about how the body shapes thought, how the body is impacted. Nobody here has questioned why we've been sitting for 2 hours reading about embodiment, but not practicing embodiment. Shouldn't we be talking about this while we're doing yoga? Shouldn't we be talking about this while we're walking? And the other example that I'll give is this is how it works. If I get up and I have an idea that I want to write about, and I swill coffee, which I tend to do, I drink a lot of coffee, and I sit down and frantically write. And then the next day I get up and I think about the same topic and I do yoga and then I write. I would submit that I'm writing 2 different papers, that the actual embodied experience of caffeine and antsiness produces a different thought in my mind than the quieting mind of yoga, right? So we know embodiment matters. Okay, so methodologies encode and decode, they generate and interpret meaning, and they play a role in the governance of meaning. So what I do is I examine methodological practices to reveal the governing logics. What are the logics that govern our methodologies, which I've tried to show you thus far through the example of the interview. Our methods, I would submit, are not outside the world. We pretend that they are. We pretend that they're timeless, but they're very much tied into the world that we are a part of. So as a methodologist, I need to come up with a material analysis of our methods, not the outcomes of our methods. And that's kind of what drives my work. I think that methods reveal and produce a Now this I'm pulling from Deleuze. If you think about something that's stuttering, it can't quite get out what it is. It's like, actually, I was gonna say it's like a record that has a scratch in it. And I almost said no one listens to records anymore, but everybody does now because it's a hip thing to do. But it is, you're trying, you're on the edge of thought, you're like this, it doesn't quite work anymore the way that it is. It's like going to another country that drives on the left side of the road. And you're there and you're about to step out to cross the road and you're like, whoo, I better not do that because the car's coming from the other way. There's a moment of productive disruption there. And so what I want to say is that's what the methodologist should do. It should make our common sense stutter. It should make our common sense skip so we can't repeat it anymore, right? And this is the example that I give, which is that we need to work with communities instead of studying communities. Now that's a simple shift, but saying that that's what we have to do takes conventional research methods and makes them stutter. As soon as you talk about working with communities, you can no longer use extractive logic. You can no longer go into a community, get the data and come out. You can no longer think without an exit strategy. right? With my students, I talk a lot about how I'm going to enter into a community, and I say, yeah, but are you going to do your study and then just leave? Isn't that terrible? Like, we work with communities, and then we're like, actually, I'm graduating. Thanks so much for getting me my publications. I'm out. And that the materialist methodologist is conceptually generative as opposed to simply describing. And because I like it, it's philosophically engaged. So this is paraphrasing Deleuze. When I look at the landscape, I'm like, maybe we have the methodologies we deserve, which is to say we've been operating in very stringent and particularly ethical practices that are extractive, right? So we get the methodologies we deserve. Deleuze says, like, maybe this is the life we deserve because we're not creative enough to think otherwise. So we need new problems to engage with pedagogies of methodology differently. So here's a long quote from Foucault. But one of the goals, and this gets back to the stuttering I was talking about for Foucault, is that what we need to do is try to wear away these self-evidences and commonplaces. What are the things that just make sense to you, that you really can't explain? To bring about with others phrases that can no longer be spoken so lightly, acts, right, that we can no longer unhesitantly perform. We need to contribute to changing things in people's ways of perceiving and doing things. We need to participate in this difficult displacement of forms of sensibility and thresholds of tolerance. Okay, there's a lot of words there. But what Foucault is really saying here is maybe our work is to try and figure out, from an ethical perspective, what should we no longer be able to say so easily? What should we no longer be able to do so easily? Now, we have examples of words that have sort of fallen out of favor because they have this terrible history, right? And then other folks maybe reclaim them in particular ways. We have certain acts, right, that just make sense, and we think, oh, maybe we should shift that a little bit, right? And you might think about it in relation to education again. We talked before about there was a movement late 60s into the 70s for kind of project-based learning that said, like, okay, learning in isolation doesn't work. Project-based learning, and as a result, something like a lecture fell out of favor. You could no longer perform the lecture so easily. And then it came back to say, actually, if you've ever experienced a really good lecture, like so much better than this one, you experience a really good lecture, it actually changes you, right? So we need to start thinking through, what are these acts that we want to have a hand in changing? So I start to ask, what are the self-evidences that we should make stutter? What are the things, the status quo that sort of we want to do? What phrases and acts should no longer be so easily performed? And because I've talked so much, I wanted to give you a moment to reflect on your own. So I'm actually going to take a moment to pause here, because what I want you to do is think in your own field of research. What are the things that make sense that you want to challenge? What are the things of convention that you have learned has to happen, that seem odd to you, that make you feel weird, right? What are the phrases and acts in your field that should no longer be so easily be performed? And I do this in my class all the time. I ask that students answer 3 basic fill-in-the-blanks. So when you think about your field, what needs to be changed? I want you to write out, I believe what? This needs to be changed. And by this I mean what? Rephrase it. And then I want you to look at those 2 phrases, those 2 sentences, and say, I'm basing this on these assumptions. So I'm going to give you like 2 minutes to do it in your head or to write it out. So just think about it for a sec, because otherwise you just get me. This is a way for me to get a drink of water. because I'm always uncomfortable with silence, we'll start now. So I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but if anyone wanted to offer what you were working through, you could. And I do this in my class when I teach. We do this multiple times over the semester because I wanted to create a paper trail of what they believe and what they assume. Yeah? And what I'll say to the students is, I don't actually really care what you believe. I mean, I care, but I don't really care. And what I want you to be able to do is restate that belief differently. But the conversation I want to have is this last one. I want to have a conversation about the assumptions that undergird your belief, because that's where change happens. It's not about the belief, it's the values and assumptions that produce the belief, yeah? So I say to them, get this stuff out of the way, and let's talk about this. As an aside, this is a writer, I used to teach writing, and this is a technique to get you generating when you're writing. So like Barbara nicely showed yesterday, when you're staring at the blank screen and you think to yourself, I have so much to say, if only I could start. Well, maybe I'll go fold laundry, and that'll help. Or maybe I'll go eat, which is what I do. Actually, just do this. I believe, what is it that you believe? You say, you make the statement, then you have to restate it in different words. And then you have to say, but I'm making some assumptions here. And you write through the assumptions. When we used to teach writing in the US, this is the perfect 5-paragraph essay. I don't know if you have this here, but when in the US, a very traditional way of asking students to respond to an essay prompt is to produce a 5-paragraph essay. So I worked with students, I would be like, here's the key. Paragraph 1, I believe. Oh, the teacher's like, great, they're putting out the thesis statement. Paragraph 2, by this I mean, ooh, look at the way they're nuancing the thesis statement with different words. It's giving it layeredness. 3 assumptions. Oh my gosh, they're making claims. There's your 5 paragraphs. And throw on a conclusion, right? So I would teach students this, and because I think it's kind of funny. It's like the key to getting it done. And they would be like, my teacher loved my essay. And I said, you already knew all of this stuff. So again, when you're sitting there and you don't know what to say, you don't know how to say it, do this. I'd encourage you to start thinking about ways you can talk about assumptions with your students, ways you can talk about assumptions with your colleagues, your peers. What are you assuming? When you work in writing groups, when you get together and share your work, don't just give it back and say, that was really smart, that was really good, you said that in this way. You need to be able to say, I see you making these assumptions. And again, it's not that the assumptions are right or wrong, it's that they're dangerous. Because these assumptions make possible these claims. These assumptions make possible what they are. Showed you very early on, here are my assumptions. But put your cards on the table, as they say. My assumption is that education needs to be open. My assumption is that methodologies need to generate change through their practice, not through their products. I'm okay with you saying, well, those are some big assumptions. Yeah, because the other assumptions that go without saying, that are the status quo, that I want to make stutter, is that it's the product that matters, not the process. It's the end goal. It's the certificate that you receive for the program of study. It's going through the program of study that matters. It's the grade. This is the problem. I am an A student. The grade becomes a subjectivity. I am a B student, right? I am a C student. When you get to graduate school, why have grades? I don't get it. Maybe it's pass, fail, maybe it's whatever. What does it mean to give an A in a graduate class? It means nothing to me, right? I still give them. It means nothing to me because I'm in the institution. I had this with my students. I think I was teaching a course on Marx, and I was teaching a course on Foucault, and they call me Dr. K. Dr. K, you're all about change. You're all about revolution. You're all about changing systems, yet you still give me a grade. And I say, yes, you should get up and walk out and go do your thing. I will give you an F, but you don't care because you don't care about grades, right? I'm a dean. I'm a faculty member. I am in the institution, right? I need to do both, and I need to work with students so that they can get through the institution even as I try to change the institution. And as a side, for the students who talk about radical ideas and have faculty who talk about radical ideas, I want to say to you, your faculty are not that radical. Why do we know they're not that radical? Because the institution would have kicked them out a long time ago if they were. And institutions of education are really good at getting rid of people who think differently, right? So your faculty are as trained as you are in normative thinking. Many of them, however, have generated this other capacity to do both. And I do think we need to do that. We were talking about this at a meal. I feel like I work at Florida International University. It's the largest Hispanic serving institution in the country of the US. We have, I think 80% of our students are first-generation students, meaning their parents did not go through college. One of my jobs is to help them negotiate the landscape of the university, even as I work to change the landscape of the university to be more welcoming and opening to them. You've got to do both. And those of you that are teaching in an elementary or a secondary school, you've got to do the same for your students. Otherwise, I think we're acting unethically. So think about this in relation to your own work. I'd love to have a conversation about the assumptions. And the last thing, I am moving to wrapping up, is I want to offer this notion of inquiry as cartography. Now, cartography is map making, right? You've seen maps, and there are some beautiful maps that are made. And what I love are the old school maps, where people mapped what they knew, and then when they didn't know what was beyond, they might write, "There be dragons," right? Because they didn't know what it was beyond there. So you'd see serpents, you'd see all these other things. That is them on the edge of their thought, I would submit. It's not just funny. It's not just them trying to be funny, right? They're like, I don't know, but I think it's kind of crazy what's out there. I think it's mystical. I want us to do that. I want us to be on the edge of thought and then be able to say, I'm not quite sure what's next, but I'm going to be creative, I'm going to be artistic, I'm going to be experimental and say, here's what might be, because that changes our imaginative capacity, right? That changes the way in which we can act. So what we need to do, I think, is we need to map the present. This is what Foucault talks about, generating a history of the present. So if you think about the history of the present, it's really hard because it's happening right now. How do we map it out? Well, we need to do it over and over and over again. Because once you map out the present, you can develop entry points. Where am I going to enter into this problem? All of us have looked at the large issues of inequities, social injustice, and the like, and thought, what can I do? It's so big. I can't do anything. You've frozen. Nah. If you map the present, you say, I'm going to enter in right here. And I know that it's not everything, but I'm going to impact this little space and it'll start changing the map, right? So it's a practice of problematization. We develop through our methods an entry point for inquiry. We locate the dominant systems that we've mapped and we problematize them. We say, not this way. And this is not new. Feminists have said this for a long time. There are indigenous methodologies and ways of thinking that have said this for a long time, that have said the way you think is not the way I think. And the way you think impacts me. In the United States, we have a long history of not doing right by our indigenous populations. Mainly, we did it by saying, you need to think like us. You need to think that you can own land. And our indigenous friends were like, what does that mean? How do you own a rock? Well, sign this form and I'll tell you. Now I own the land, right? So we forced it upon them. So we locate what are the dominant systems and we problematize them, which is what I do, my work in methods. What are the dominant systems of methodology, of how we come to know? And I want to mess with them. I had a faculty member say, Kuntz, you do this work and it makes me feel like I can't even do an interview. I'm like, good. He's like, why is that a good thing? I was like, because you're stuttering. Now maybe you'll think creatively about how I will do the interview rather than just doing it. Maybe you'll do it, but you'll do it knowing that you're giving up some things, right? That you're taking on some assumptions. So this is, I swear I'm basically done. This moves towards like a very mundane example of how we might teach methods. And my colleague and I came up with this notion of teaching methods despite content or without content? And we asked this question, like, what's the relationship between methods and content in educational research? And the reason I say this is a mundane example is my colleague's name is Liz, and we talked about how we were teaching, and we realized we were talking in two different ways, or we were teaching in two different ways. She was teaching from this methodologies despite content, which meant students would come into her intro class and she would give them a problem. She would give them a topic, and it was generalized. Students were coming to my class and I was like, I don't know what you're studying, tell me, you do it. So the students brought the topics with them. See, two very different ways of teaching, very kind of mundane. But I do think that they have implications. So when Liz was teaching, we started talking, and she was like, my goal is they're coming to take an intro to qualitative research course. I want to kind of disrupt or make stutter traditionally statistical ways of thinking. I want to get people to start thinking qualitatively as opposed to statistically. So students would come to take her class. She would say, we're all going to study the graduate student experience, right? This is a very typical way, and because these are graduate students. And the students will be both researcher and participant, right? I'm going to interview you, you interview me, it's common across. Well, there are some implications here because students might be disinterested, be like, I don't really care about that. Why should I do that? I've got no passion. But you see that the point is for Liz, and I think, again, it's not that it's right or wrong, it's that it's dangerous. You learn the method together around the common topic, yeah? So it's a very productive, she's an amazing teacher. I was going in and I was like, I don't really want to disrupt the quantitative ways of thinking. I actually want to disrupt the qualitative ways of thinking because I think people are already thinking about them in qualitative ways. So I asked students to come up with topics by themselves. What are the topics that interest you in the class? And then your job as a student is to outline your field of study to your peers. This is my field, because I get students from all over campus, social work, sociology, communications, as well as education. So I actually think describing your field to a peer is a skill. This is what we do, this is why we do it, these are our assumptions. And then we come up with methodological quandaries. Wow, that's hard to study. How would we do it? So do you see, we're not prescribing methods. I don't actually know the methods that we're using yet in that intro class. Again, it's not that it's right or wrong. It's dangerous in particular ways. I find it helpful. But also what I found was students maybe felt ungrounded. They're like, I want to learn some basic methods. And I'm like, I don't know yet what it is. So both of these, both Liz's perspective and mine are useful in particular ways and not useful in particular ways. So the reason I give this kind of mundane example is to say that the assumptions we make about how we structure our classes, design our curriculum, facilitate our classes, extend from these larger order assumptions about what matters and why. And I'm done. I'd like to invite you all, if you want to come. This is my campus. This is Florida International University. This is a library. This is on a beautiful day. It's not like that right now because it's very hot and humid. But I thank you so much for your attention. I would love to talk more. If you want to email me, my email is there. But thanks again.
Obrigada, professor. Vou esperar ele colocar o fone.
Thank you.
Que aí ele consegue me ouvir em inglês.
Thank you, Professor.
Você está me ouvindo?
Can you hear me, Professor?
It is okay. Yeah.
Says yes. Okay.
Obrigada pela sua
So
fala.
thank you for your lecture. I believe we're all very reflective right now, and I'd like to tell you that we have about 40 people listening to us also on YouTube, and many praising you about your content. So I'm going to ask you the question from Anair. She asks, in your trajectory as a researcher, have you found more researchers that are conventional or relational? Can we say that relational research requires more from the researcher?
Yes, great questions. So I think historically there are more conventional researchers, or let me say it this way, more conventional researchers have made their way into or been allowed into the publications that we read. So The reason I phrase it that way is maybe there are some very relational researchers, but we don't get the chance to read them because their articles are rejected, or they're disciplined out of being able to work in that way. The other, I think, part of the question, if I caught it, was, does it ask more of the researcher? Yes, does relational inquiry ask more of the researcher? I think yes. And that's an assumption. I want to say it asks different things of the researcher, but I think that it's hard, and part of the reason that it's hard is because you have to let go of what you've been trained for, right? When you come in, what I've been showing up here is really hard for students to undertake because they have to unlearn a lot of stuff. And as an aside, really open faculty member to say, yeah, I'm going to engage on this project with you, not knowing what the outcome's going to be and not knowing what the methods are going to be, because we got to get in there and mess things up. So I do think it asks more of the researcher, but again, that's a value statement on my behalf. I think it just asks other things of the researcher, and I don't think we've got it figured out yet. So I think this is why it's exciting to me. I think we're right on the edge. There's a lot of people, like I recommend the work of Rosie Braidotti, in addition to like Michel Foucault and others, who are right on the edge of thought, and they're not prescribing the methods yet. They're saying, how do we understand it? And how can we come to understand it? So I think it's very challenging.
Obrigada, professor.
Thank you, Professor. And she also complements the question by saying, what is your advice to perform more research based on a relational perspective? And I'm going to supplement it myself, because you started the lecture talking about the importance of taking on our vulnerabilities and talking about a lecture that you had the opportunity to participate. So I'd like to know, how can we develop ourselves as researchers for the practice of this sort of research? Because it's very tough. We are very much used to the way it has always been done. Sometimes we're even tired. But what would be practical tips for us to be able to transform ourselves as researchers, and in addition to that, perform more relational research, as she asked in her question?
Yes, I think this is key, and it's huge. So I think this is a place where students can productively challenge their faculty a little bit to say, I want to see things in process, right? I don't want to just see the end. Have you ever, and this is hard, but I did this, have you ever asked a faculty member to see a draft of the paper before it was published, right? To see a draft, a working draft. And some faculty will come in and show you. I do this, I'm like, here it is. And I write, and it's all scribbly and everything. So I try to show the process. The other thing, and I'm seeing it happen here, is I think graduate students need to organize their own areas that is safe for this type of vulnerability. And the reason I'm saying I see it here is you are having your own roundtables, your own discussions led by graduate students that incorporate graduate students. So you can say the question, I don't know. Right? You can say this type of question. It is very vulnerable. And so we need to develop informal spaces and formal spaces for this. Also, I think you've got to challenge your faculty in a respectful way. And I think the faculty that I've met here, wow, I think they would be open, and many of them are here, so here's my challenge to them, to say, how can we think of something that has not been thought of yet? How can we work through this methodological quandary? How can we do this without fully knowing? Show me and let's talk it together. And then say to your faculty, what are the things that you don't know? What are the things that you're working on that you don't yet know? Because of my personality, I'm always talking about stuff I don't know. I'm like, I don't actually know about this. So I think it's, and the reason I give this as an example is it starts to open up the conversation around process, and that can become a normalized thing as well. It explodes this notion of like all we get are products. And then I do think that students, and we heard this in some of the other talks, students have a very privileged position to challenge. You can do it in appropriate ways, because here's the secret. Faculty want you to graduate. Institutions need you to graduate. So it's really hard to get kicked out. So I just would say, get up, start challenging, start asking these types of questions. those of you that I've met, I think you're already doing it. I will just say that. I've had conversations with people and I can see in their eyes, they're like, yeah, I don't fully follow you there. I'm gonna ask this follow-up question like you just did. So I think you're already practicing it here. This is the beauty of doctoral work, because I think you're positioned as an emerging scholar who you should ask questions. I think it was Christopher Irwin who said that. He's like, you should ask questions because you should not know everything. The thing we have to do with our faculty is get them to recognize they don't know everything either.
Obrigada, professor. Eu vou dar oportunidade para algumas pessoas que estão aqui,
I have opportunity for some people here, but I say that we have other questions in the chat. I can talk with you later and answer because of our time constraints. But let's see for the on-site questions, if we have any.
Dr. Hero,
Dr. Hero.
I introduced myself already to you yesterday. I was very, very impressed during the introduction here when I got about your publications, more than 50 research publications and some books. And I was asking myself, what magic did you make to do that? And now I'm asking, now my question is about your self-assessment. After doing researches, have you ever experienced, because during the presentation you talk much about Foucault, and Foucault much about experience. Have you experienced yourself, after doing researches, writing, consecrating your time, and at the end for the publication, your research is rejected? If yes, what have been your feelings? Thank you.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, let me think. So, have I experienced rejection? Yes, over and over again. Here's what you should know about me. Writing is very important to me. I write so that I live differently. I don't know how else to explain it, because when I write, I come to understand a concept or an issue, and it changes the way I walk through the world. And this is the other thing that's weird about me, and here I am on the edge of my thought. I am a terrible grammarian. That is, I am terrible at looking, here's the adjective, here's the verb. I mean, I can isolate them, but you know, some people, what is it that they call when they do the sentences? I forget what it is. You do it in primary school. Syntax and that type of thing. Yeah, I am disinterested in that. When I write, a sentence feels good. I don't know how else to say it. I write and I get a cadence. I get going and I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. That feels good. Okay, that makes sense. And when I go back and I revise, I'll read and I was like, that doesn't feel good. So it is a very embodied experience for me. And so as a result, you say, you know, the other thing is I would say, don't worry about how many publications I have. That was my job at the time, right? So like, it was what I had to do. The graduate students are doing 100 different things. You know, they're bartenders, they're doing this, and they're writing. So there's that. But it is a product of, like, I don't think I could stop writing because, again, it changes me. And I'm a big believer in that. And part of the privilege of being in my position now, and I do write articles, but I write books. It's because you're given the time and space to work through an argument or an issue. So I think that's it. So let me get to the rejection part, because that's a little more interesting. I've been rejected so many times, and it still happens. And it took me a little bit to realize that they were rejecting the manuscript and not the person. Because it's so easy to tie your subjectivity to, I am a person who publishes a lot. I am a person who does whatever. It is my self-worth. I would get them and I would be like, oh my gosh, I need to take a breath from this. Instead, I got feisty. And you will often get, Barbara referenced this, contradictory reviews. So I would write back to the editor and say, I like this review, I think this makes sense. This one makes no sense to me, and I'm not quite sure they fully read my paper. So I think I'm gonna answer this one, are you okay with that? And good editors will say like, okay, yeah, it makes sense to me. They'll often send out to 3 reviews, and you hope that you get 2 positive ones. So this is part of my personality. I structure my response to the editors to say, I'm gonna respond to these. I'm not responding to this. Those of you, when you have your juries, your dissertation defenses or thesis, the best thing you can say is, that's such a great question, and it's beyond the scope of my study. You say, you set the parameters for your jurist, right? So I do that. I said, that is such a good question they asked me about that manuscript. I'm happy to write about it in another study. It's not this one. So you have to be able to say, but you have to be able to look at your paper and understand that. The other thing I'll say, the last metaphor is, I believe that we need to look at studies like an architect looks at a house. So you can look at a study and see how they kind of built the argument, and then see the foundations that under which the argument is laid and that type of thing. We need to be able to do that with our own work, to say like, can I get the distance to say, it's not just that I think it's good, but here's how I built the argument. And yeah, that's actually a really good point, whatever they said. I have learned so much from the peer reviews. I've become a better writer, I've become a better thinker. But I do reject the rejections sometimes. And I can do that because it's my study.
Obrigada. Eu vou para a pergunta da
Thank you,
Letícia.
Professor Leticia's questions, and we're going to draw to a close. But if you have more questions, please, I can refer them to Professor Aaron, and then we can restart.
Aaron, I'm a master's degree student, and my teachers usually say that we can talk about what went wrong in our researches, but we don't actually see that in the articles we read. Do you think we should write more and publish more about what went wrong?
I would love that. Normally in a traditional manuscript, we have a limitations section, which normally you try to make that as small as possible because you want to say like, I don't have that many limitations, I'm fabulous. So there is a little space. I would love to see an article, and I think there are, I don't remember them offhand, but sometimes there are articles that are written on what went wrong. It's, and I will say in the sciences, they do this. It is not having a finding is a finding. Right? If you do an experiment and nothing happens, that's actually a finding. Oh, that's interesting, nothing happened. I thought something would happen, but it didn't. So we can actually draw from some of the sciences to say, we should say, here's what went wrong. Where you do see it is in some of the methodological journals. So there's like the Journal of Qualitative Inquiry or Qualitative Research and Education, because they take seriously the methodology sections, and you can write through, this didn't work. Right? This didn't work, but you would talk about it as methodology. And I think I would encourage everyone to read the methodology journals, because when I talk with students, I'm like, I know how you read articles. You read the intro, you're like, that's interesting. You look at the citations, you skip over the methodology, and you get right to the findings, right? Because that's what you're gonna report in your own lit reviews. You gotta go back and look at the methodologies and say, this is how they came to their findings, right? This is how they generated it. So yeah, I'm all for sort of finding it. I would love that, when you do this next year, have a session on what went wrong. Right? And have a session about like, here are all the missteps, because some of them are hilarious. One time I did it was right after my dissertation, I was doing an interview, and I put down, we used to have recorders, not your phone. and we put also our phone next to it, and I didn't realize that the old phones, they made a beeping sound that you couldn't hear, but the recorder could pick up. And so the whole time it was like you were in an emergency ward or something. Someone's talking beep, beep, beep. So I couldn't hear, right? So I had to go redo it. It's like these small things I think are important. But yeah, have a session on what went wrong and really talk through, because we can learn from it. I think it's a brilliant idea.
Obrigada, Professor Aaron.
Thank you so much, Professor. And I'd be unfair if I were not to say very quickly that it is a practice that the teacher Dilmeide, Professor Dilmeide tells us. During my doctorate, I heard a lot, Fernanda, if it didn't work out, that's also an outcome. And in addition to that, a practice that we have in our group, which I think that it's cool to share, is to leave the papers and articles underway open for anybody in the group to look at. So we often see corrections from each other, and this helps us to grow. So also have to thank Professor Dumedi for that, because this is a practice that we have. And Aaron, I'd like to thank you for your speech. You talked about a good lecture that transforms us, and I'm coming out of here transformed, and I believe that many of you, also the guys at home as well. So I'd like to thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Perguntas nos fazem ficar inquietos. Perguntas fazem o mundo girar. As grandes descobertas, as grandes invenções, os grandes textos filosóficos, todos partiram de uma pergunta. As respostas não são fáceis, exigem esforço e dedicação. E esse é o trabalho do pesquisador. Cada pesquisador e cada pesquisadora são pilares da ciência. São eles que movimentam e geram desenvolvimento social e humano e trazem respostas necessárias à vida moderna. E não é só isso. Também geram mais e mais questionamentos que fazem do mundo uma constante, um eterno descobrir. Nós, do Grupo CIDES, somos comprometidos com uma educação do futuro. Valorizamos e incentivamos a pergunta e, sobretudo, o trabalho do pesquisador. Venha conosco nessa grande caminhada pelo conhecimento.